All right, everybody, welcome back to our third lecture together. I'm glad to be back with you all, and we're going to take a look today. We're finally moving on from the Hebrew Bible. Although this title is a little bit of a tease, we're going to start with something from the writings, from the Ketuvim, but it's going to bring us out of the Hebrew Bible. Um, does anyone know what this image on the left here is supposed to be depicting? Just out of curiosity. It's okay if not. Just a artistic representation of these Kabbalistic ideas. We're going to talk a bit towards the end about the kind of divineness and these different emanations of God in Kabbalistic tradition. And so there is like the highest form, the kind of unity, the oneness, the Ein Sof without end. And then there are these different emanations or sephirot. And we're going to take a look at those and the gender implications. And I just thought that was a pretty colorful image to get us started. So we'll be coming back to that later on this hour. So just in case anyone has missed the first couple of these lectures, we focused a lot week one on the Torah, looking at the different creations of humanity. And we took a look into what it means when we talk about biblical patriarchy. And we looked at particular examples from the book of Genesis. And we talked about women's agency, as well as their limitations in their social roles in those stories. Last week, we took a look at prophets and writing. So if we're thinking of the Tanakh, the first week was the Tav, and the second week was the Nach. And so we started with Miriam, looking at female prophecy in the Hebrew Bible. We explored covenant at Mount Sinai, biblical narrative, and who that really is for, who that includes. And we looked at female depictions in prophetic and wisdom literature, some of which were a little disturbing. And today we're going to be talking about we're going to be starting with the Song of Songs. That's kind of our entryway out of the Hebrew Bible. And we'll take a look at rabbinic perspectives on gender and sex, which will lead us into Kabbalah. So I just wanted to kind of take a moment to think. We're not reading in great detail or anything, but for anyone who's familiar with the Song of Songs, it's a very interesting text. In our Jewish canon, it's found in the Ketuvim, in the writing. Christian Bibles will place it a little bit differently, so it's found in the poetic and wisdom books. And it's actually an Israelite kind of love poem, traditionally attributed to Solomon. So we have a few reasons why. There are references to him in the poem. The opening lines, Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs, Asher LeShlomah. So there's this attribution to Shlomo or Solomon. And there are biblical references to him as a composer of songs as well in First Kings and the Deuteronomistic history, which we talked a little bit about last week. And the text itself is in the form of a dialogue between two lovers. And it's actually dominated more by the female voice. And it's a back and forth between these two lovers. And before I kind of start, talking a bit more, I wondered, for those of you who might be familiar with this text, what maybe makes it biblical and what maybe marks this as a separate text. Even if you're not as familiar with the Song of Songs, based on this description, does this sound like what we've been looking at in Genesis or in the prophetic writings, or any sort of thoughts or feelings, whatever you know or think about the Song of Songs coming into it?
If I recall correctly, God's never mentioned in it.
That is a really interesting point. Yes. Thanks, Nan. So God is never explicitly mentioned in the text, which is very rare in what we would define as biblical texts, as canonical texts within our tradition. That seems to be a point of contention as to what the text is really about. So some interpreters will find reference to God in the text, but God is never explicitly named. That is absolutely correct. And so that's a little bit different just from the get-go, right? So we've had so much emphasis on this idea of covenant, on God's will, God's law, God's promises to his people. And this is two lovers frolicking, careless abandon. Anything that maybe marks it as biblical to us, or, anything that seems to signal why it might be part of this canon.
I'll make another comment about that.
Yeah.
If you're interested in mystical stuff, that this can be seen as a love poem between God and the hearer, or the and that so it's for people who are interested in mystical traditions, this is a very lovely way to enter into it.
Definitely. Thank you, Nan. So we're going to be talking about mysticism. So you made a perfect segue. I was just going to say, it's a Hebrew text. Most of the other texts we have in the Hebrew Bible are composed in Hebrew. Most writings in Aramaic or any other languages were not deemed appropriate for the canon. So that was going to be my sort of simple thing. But absolutely, there's also this mystical component and aspect that has been understood by many readers. So we're going to focus a little bit on that as well. But first, I just wanted to this is partly in jest and for fun, but I think it's also helpful to kind of illustrate the representation of the female lover as per the Song of Songs. This is like a realistic illustration of what she would actually look like with all of these sort of similes and metaphors and poetic devices. So your eyes are like doves behind your veil. You can see that her eyes there are actually doves. Your hair is like a flock of goats streaming down Mount Gilead. And there we have all of the goats. Your teeth are like a flock of ewes. You can see my cursor, right? So climbing up from the washing pool, all of them bear twins and not one loses her young. Your lips are like a crimson thread. Your mouth is lovely. Your brow beneath your veil gleams like a pomegranate split open. So here's that pomegranate that's splitting open. Your neck is like the Tower of David, built to hold weapons, hung with 1,000 shields. Your breasts are like two fawns, twins of a gazelle. Your limbs are an orchard of pomegranates and of all luscious fruits, of henna and of nard. You are garden spring, a well of fresh water, a rill of Lebanon. So any thoughts with that very literalistic illustration of the lover? It always makes me kind of chuckle. And I think when we're considering how women are represented and how women are depicted, I think it's interesting to kind of, look at the cultural components here, these images that would have been particularly probably sort of rife with symbolism and very fresh. You always want a metaphor or a literary device like that to really be illuminating for the audience that it's targeting. These are perhaps not the most illuminating images for us today, but we have to imagine that, within the context of this actual composition, these would have been particularly striking images. And I think it's also just fun to kind of imagine and see what this looks like. But the real reason I wanted to take a look at the Song of Songs, Bonnie, I see there's a hand. Should I go back a slide?
You may actually be touching on this, but I always thought I had heard, and in hearing you read this and see this, that using the woman is metaphorical perhaps about the Hebrews, the Jewish people, and things that are lovely. So you take a woman that you say is lovely, and you give her the attributes that you ascribe to your peoplehood or your country or whatever we decide maybe that this is what he's actually writing about.
Right. Yeah, that's a really great point. And I think I'm not sure if you were here last week when we talked about the prophetic imagery and the kind of marital metaphor, some of which was very much tinged with violent imagery in the classic prophetic literature, but this idea of the people Israel as kind of the wife of God, and that there is this unity. So I think that's very much one way to potentially read the text. Interestingly enough, as you know, as you noted, or as was it Nan who noted, God's name is not mentioned in this text. So these are interpretive choices, and you know, who's to say there is value in that? There's a reason this is maintained in our canon as a religious sacred text. It's also really interesting. If we had a bit more time, we would have explored the commonalities between this and other ancient Near Eastern love poetry. There's a lot of kind of parallels there. And so this, on the one hand, this poem seems to be part of a greater literary tradition, which may or may not be drawing on sort of divine aspects and images of this human relationship as modeling the divine. So that's definitely something we're going to come back to very shortly. And so I think I said this last week in reference to rabbinic perspectives when we were talking about stuff like however many rabbis, you get more opinions. And so we actually find in the Mishnaic literature that there is a great deal of kind of dissent about the sanctity and the sacredness of the Song of Songs, but that in having these conversations, Rabbi Akiva, who's one of the great rabbinic sages, actually advocates for this text not merely as a holy text, but as the holiest of holy texts. And so this passage here, we're not going to read in full, but this bullet here, all the holy scriptures, this is from Mishnah Yadayim, all the holy scriptures are said to defile the hands. And so you need to sort of purify your hands before and after touching those writings. And the Song of Songs and Kohelet defile the hands. So this is asserting that these two texts, Kohelet being Ecclesiastes and the Song of Songs, should be considered Jewish scripture, should be considered as authoritative texts. And so Rabbi Judah says the Song of Songs defiles the hands, but there is a dispute about this other text, Ecclesiastes. Rabbi Yossi says Kohelet does not defile the hands, but there is a dispute about the Song of Songs. So we get a lot of different dissenting views. And ultimately, this seems to be settled with Rabbi Akiva. As I mentioned, no man in Israel disputed that the Song of Songs, that it does not defile the hands, for the whole world is not as worthy on the day as the day on which the Song of Songs was given to Israel. For all the writings are holy, but the Song of Songs is the holy of holies. So I thought this was a helpful segue into two things we're going to talk about today. So one of those being the kind of rabbinic style of discourse and the ways in which we find sort of dissenting views all printed alongside one another. There is not usually one truth or one argument that is, seen as the only correct option. There is, we preserve in rabbinic tradition the views of many dissenting sages, and all of those have merit. There are just some perspectives that become more privileged within the tradition. So Karen, did you have a question?
Yes, I guess I'm confused. Why would it defile the hands.
Right. I think so. So yeah, the context for this conversation in the Mishnaic, defiling the hands is actually a way of describing a text that is sacred that you need to cleanse before or after. So even though it sounds like a negative thing, it's actually the fact that we can't just approach these texts in and of themselves. It's like visiting the temple in ancient Israel. You have to do the proper purification rites before that, because otherwise you are not worthy of going near the sort of purity and divinity of God. And so this discussion here that we have within Mishnah Yadayim is just a discussion as to the kind of authority and sanctity of the Song of Songs. And what we're finding here is that the dominant voice here for Rabbi Akiva advocates for its inclusion in the canon. And so I think it's interesting to look at just in terms of kind of the ways in which rabbinic discourse is expressed and preserved in rabbinic tradition. And what we're also going to come back to as I think it was Bonnie mentioned, is this idea of sort of unification through intimacy, through love, that really finds sway in later mystical Kabbalah. So Aaron, you had a question as well?
Yeah, I do. So why do they attribute this to Solomon? Is there something that dates it, at the time period? Is there something? Is there something in the language that's coherent enough that it's one author? I mean, it's like
no to both of those. These are traditional attributions, and so anything. The traditional view is that like a lot of the wisdom literature and the Ketuvim that we have in the Hebrew Bible is composed by Solomon because of the tradition that Solomon was the wisest man, the wisest king ever. And so these are not historical attributions. These are ones that in Jewish tradition, the song has been associated and linked with him. It's not an objective thing, but it is kind of the way it's been read throughout much of our Jewish history of interpretation. Does that clarify?
It clarifies, but it leaves us
with some questions.
It leaves us with no way to put it in a historic context.
Yeah, in terms of putting it in a historic context, I can share some resources afterwards if you're interested. Chances are, it's very likely a composite text. And I have some sort of comparative verses and stuff that link back to similar concepts that are depicted in, as I said, sort of Sumerian love poetry and other ancient Near Eastern. So there seems to be this kind of common literary tradition, probably oral as well. And the part of the way that texts get canonized and actually stay in the canon is often through a kind of attribution. So just like the 5 books of Torah are viewed as the 5 books of Moses, because Moses traditionally is the one who writes everything down, writes the Torah down at Sinai. The wisdom and writings traditions here are strongly affiliated on a traditional level with Solomon. But there are aspects that could help us date it. It's also, there aren't a ton of historical references by which to kind of lock it in place. So hope that helps us in the way that it doesn't totally answer the question, but we can sidestep it for now. This leads us into a kind of just overview of rabbinic tradition. I'm guessing some of this may be review, but I just thought it was helpful in discussing this to kind of outline how rabbinic discourse functions. And then we're going to take a look at how gender is understood within rabbinic tradition. So one thing to keep in mind here, and we talked a little bit about this as well with the Hebrew Bible, but it's the same with the rabbinic corpus of literature, that the development of this tradition is not a linear process, and there are different Jewish factions that give rise to different interpretations of Torah, and within the Mishnah, there are different perspectives preserved, but it's the Pharisees, who are a particular sect from the Second Temple period in ancient Israel, who have this emphasis on an oral Torah that was passed down to Moses and the people of Israel alongside the written one. And historians have linked this class of Pharisees, this particular sect, with the roots for the rabbinic movement after the destruction of the temple. And so the rabbinic corpus of texts is actually understood within that framework as a writing down of this oral Torah that had been with the Jewish people from the beginning, from when the Torah was given to them. But effectively, it serves to interpret the written Torah, fill in a lot of the gaps, and it's an ongoing discussion. And so you can see on the right-hand side the image there of what a page of Mishnah actually looks like. And we have a base biblical text in the middle, and all around it are these various interpretations and commentaries by different rabbinic sages, and we have preserved the discourse and dissensions between them. And so we have, I've mentioned the Mishnah, which is a commentary on the Torah, which we can date to around 200 CE. And then the Talmud is a subsequent commentary that is written on the Mishnah. And so rabbinic tradition and these texts really serve as a bridge between the sort of temple-bound Israelite tradition and what becomes rabbinic Judaism. Rabbinic Judaism emerges after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, because a lot of what the Torah has in it in terms of law is really in reference to an actual temple, to sacrificial worship, and to a whole host of things that actually aren't possible without a physical temple. And so the rabbis, their ingenuity is what sort of propels ancient Israelite religion, which is now defunct of its central institution, what propels it into the future of rabbinic Judaism. And when we talk about law, it's just also important to note that this term is understood and used kind of loosely. So rabbinic texts preserve a record of conversations, as I've said, and disputes. And even within that, we have we have two different versions of Talmud that have been preserved, one in fuller form and one has been more dominant. But just all this to say, there is no one right way of reading scripture. There is no one singular voice or authority on rabbinic tradition. The beauty and sometimes the frustration is that there are a ton of different answers for everything that these rabbis were asking, and spoiler alert, they wanted to know more about everything. So when we talk about law, we're also talking about halacha. So halacha comes from the Hebrew root halach, to walk or to go. And within Judaism, it refers to the teachings and rules which are meant to guide one's life. And so the laws within the Torah in Exodus and Leviticus primarily serve as the backbone of the emergent Jewish tradition. They are the basis out of which the rabbis are going to construct halacha through their interpretation of these prior laws. And what's really important to note here is that Jewish law presumes a gender binary. So right in the beginning of creation, we have, we talked in the first week, male and female, he created them. And what's really important here is that there are going to be implications in terms of halachic duties. And so this comes back to the idea we talked a lot about in terms of kind of who's involved in the covenant, who is part of the community that will become the Jewish people. And we see this play out in interesting ways. And so many of us are likely familiar with the rabbinic idea that there are 613 commandments or mitzvot in all of the Torah, but 4 of them are really central to Jewish identity. And we'll note that that at least 2 of them are really only things that men do. So the rite of circumcision, we don't circumcise women in Jewish tradition, but that is a marker of Jewish identity. And so just like how we talked about who was actually receiving the covenant at Sinai, in sort of the explication of the law that the rabbis tried to do, we also see a privileging of male experience and of male perspectives here. And that is really clear in the way that a lot of the central commandments, circumcision, also the recitation of the Shema, are really male activities. Aaron, you had a question?
Yeah, I have a question. So the Song of Songs, the object of the Song of Songs is clearly a woman. You can tell from the picture. But is there any evidence that the speaker of the Song of Songs is male?
So it goes back and forth as a dialogue. And so there are points of the male speaker, but he's describing his female beloved.
So you don't. So how do you know it's male?
The imagery and the grammar and stuff is pretty clearly male.
Okay.
In the Hebrew, but that's a good question. So where was I? And so yeah, so I just wanted to kind of emphasize, obviously, the rabbinic tradition is what gives us kashrut laws out of the Levitical law of do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. The rabbis take this one step further. The sect out of which the rabbis emerge, the Pharisees, are kind of known in antiquity for their overly perhaps literalistic and detailed expressions of figuring out exactly how to translate some of these laws. So do not boil a kid in its mother's milk probably means you're buying these animals at a market and you want to make sure you're not like getting it's a more technical thing, but there's an expansive view of law that emerges in the rabbinic consciousness that extends what were initially more limited rules into a whole system of law. Ellis?
You said 2 of these were male. Besides the first one, which of the others is
well,
is
so
familiar?
the Shema is also not really a female obligation in the rabbinic tradition. So women are maintaining kosher and they're going to be observing the key holidays and festivals, but the other 2, the actual prayer and and wearing of the prayer instruments and stuff these are male things. So tefillin, etc. So in this way we see that I that's why I titled this slide whose halacha is it anyway. And we have this, I brought back Lego Moses because he was adorable. But really the question here is how much are women included in this? And I think that's a valid question. Lynn?
Yeah, thanks. So some of us are reading the Talmud with the Daf Yomi, and I don't want to get too much into the weeds with that because it wouldn't be fair to everybody else. But one of the commandments in the Torah, which as I understand it, and the Talmud says it repeatedly, is to reproduce, and that commandment is directed to men, but not to women. And so how do the rabbis figure that one?
We're going to come to that a little bit, actually.
Okay.
So
I mean, are we going to? Okay, perfect.
We're going to explore that sort of active-passive dichotomy.
Okay, perfect. Are we going to get into some of the non-binary genders that the Talmud comes up with too? Perfect. Yeah. I can't wait. Thank you.
That's what's coming. So I'm glad we're excited. I just kind of wanted to get us oriented first. especially in case I didn't know what everyone's level of knowledge and experience. These texts can be rather challenging. So we're starting with some of the basics, but we'll be getting there. Nan, I see you also have a
Yeah.
question.
I wasn't aware about the Shema being a male.
I think, sorry, I might be oversimplifying. What I'm thinking more so is the reciting of the Shema is in part, sorry, I should have been more clear. The Shema is not a male thing, but the instruction for the Shema in Deuteronomy has the instruction to bind yourself. And so the recitation of the Shema with tefillin is a male activity.
So would traditionally women not have recited the Shema during like services or anything like that?
Traditionally, I'm not sure. I can't speak to all communities, but I think it would be less of a requirement than it is for men who are intended to, wrap themselves up in the prayer phylacteries and the tefillin. So, sorry, thank you actually, because that was, as I was saying that, I realized that wasn't super clear. So,
thank you.
Yeah, definitely. So, and then exactly, this is what I was thinking in the next slide here. So I have the father and the sons here. It's just a stock image I found, but it was cute. With praying in front of what looks like the Kotel, the Western Wall, and they are praying in a way that, we're going to come to this next week, actually, when we talk about gender in Israel, and we're going to focus a little bit on the question of the women at the wall and female prayer. But this is kind of a sneak peek that, a lot of the things that are seen as essential to Jewish identity and in terms of halachic responsibilities are really allocated as being for the men only within the rabbinic text. And so that poses some problems. So Mishnah Sota asks, what is the difference between a man and a woman? And I thought this was really interesting. The Hebrew here was very simple. It was like, what is different between, like words were missing, but the translation that I found for this actually added some words in. So the Hebrew is saying, what is between, like what is the difference between these two? And it got translated as, what are the halachic differences between a man and a woman? And so in this text, we see the distinction of male and female, and it's articulated explicitly through a breakdown of their halachic responsibilities. And so here we see that on the one hand, there is this exclusion of women from some of the core practices and traditions that are fundamentally Jewish. At the same time, this distinction seems to be more in terms of actual, functionality and what people are doing, rather than a kind of essential difference between men and women. And so we have this further articulated in Mishnah Kiddushin 1:7, with regard to all mitzvot of a son, men are obligated to perform them and women are exempt. And with regard to all the mitzvot of a father with regard to a son, both men and women are obligated to perform them. And so there are these different rulings based on what men and women can and should do. But generally, we're going to find that women are not required or encouraged to do as many. And so one really important aspect of this is that, and this comes back again to the reciting of the Shema. Women are not forbidden, as far as I know, from reciting the Shema in rabbinic tradition, but they are not bound to do so not only with the tefillin, but at certain times of the day. And so the way this gets articulated by scholars of rabbinic tradition is that and actually in the text is that the men are themselves bound to these positive time-bound mitzvot. So these are commandments that must be performed at very particular times. Men are obligated to perform them and women are exempt. Anything that is not time-bound, that doesn't require a certain time for its performance, both men and women are obligated to perform them. And with regard to all prohibitions, even whether or not they're time bound or not time bound, both men and women are obligated to observe them. So here we have sort of a gender differentiation, but it's not in terms of qualities at this point of men and women, it's in terms of their obligations. And so I think that's a really important distinction to make. And Lynn says men and women are required to eat unleavened bread on the first day of Passover. Yes. But that is more in terms of the calendrical cycle of the year, not in terms of sort of a daily prayer ritual. So there are some parts where, you know, this maybe doesn't align quite as well, but this is word for word from the Mishnah, that it's these particular, however the rabbis are defining time bound, that may not be exactly how we would characterize them. But there is a distinction here of what men and women ought to do. And there also seems to be a kind of asymmetry that I wanted to highlight of gender within rabbinic thought. And so on the one hand, you know, there are men, there are women, you know, the Genesis passage of, you know, male and female, he created them. That seems like a kind of binary that may or may not be symmetrical. But as I have already alluded to, women here are exempted, one might say excluded, from key rituals that serve as the basis for a positive formation of Jewish identity. And so the scholar Charlotte Elsheva von Robert refers to this as kind of full halachic subjectivity. And that's where women do not have the same kind of rights within the Mishnaic tradition. And so they are less of a full subject, halachically speaking, within this tradition. And so that's important. And Aaron adds that women's property rights are less than men's in the Talmud. Yes, totally. And so the image I have on the right here, it's actually the 40th anniversary of Barbara Streisand's Yentl movie. I know a theater near me is actually screening that for the 40th anniversary, I guess, with her memoir coming out. But I just thought it was, you know, a cute image here, or something less cute, which is women being excluded from also teaching Torah. And so I have a passage here that's very technical, and it's kind of this rabbinic discourse of, well, where do we see this? And there's a proof text. There is a kind of example that is taken as the authoritative reasoning for a particular decision. And so you shall teach in the Hebrew, it should be read as you shall study. Whoever is commanded to study Torah is commanded to teach, and whoever is not commanded to study is not commanded to teach. So it's a very kind of circular logic here. But effectively, there is this assertion, so you shall teach them to your sons. Ergo, that must be an exclusion. This emphasizes your sons and not your daughters. And so traditionally, women were and would have been excluded from studying Torah, which is interesting, and studying and teaching Torah, because, you know, they're not unfamiliar with the tradition, but they do not have the same rights. And this is, if any of you Yentl, that's kind of the central question she's asking in that film of like, well, where is it written? Why can't I study? And so this is not necessarily something that is great about this tradition. I did want to come back to, was it Nan or Lynn who mentioned the kind of active and passive language of women and intercourse?
I think it
It
was
wasn't
one.
me.
Oh,
Oh, maybe was it Bonnie who's off camera? I'm just looking at faces.
yeah, it may have been Bonnie.
Okay. So something else to kind of take note of here is that within rabbinic kind of consciousness, first of all, remember these texts are written within a kind of silo of these male sages trying to interpret these Torah and the Jewish tradition. But it's interesting to note that all the cognate verbs for acts of marriage are always active in the rabbinic texts, and they're written in the passive form in the case of women. And so things like sanctifying marriage, acquiring sexual relations, it's always the man doing the thing and the woman is being acted upon. And so again, we see this kind of lack of symmetry. There is a duality in terms of you have men, you have women. And as I also mentioned, it's not to say that women are inherently less than, but within this tradition, by the same token, the men seem to be the drivers of the action, and they are more sort of fully halachic, but they have fuller halachic subjectivity, if we want to use von Robert's words.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Yeah, totally.
I don't know if I'm on screen or not. Sorry.
You're on my screen. I have everybody.
Okay. Okay. About the verse in Deuteronomy about your sons, you shall teach them to your sons. Is that word in Hebrew to your sons? Does it actually say sons or does it say offspring?
I think it's one of those cases, once again, I'd have to double check, where the collective plural is the masculine. And so it has been read as sons, whether or not, and likely in antiquity, that would have been the intended audience. That would have been the interpretation, and what was being meant. However, in terms of reading it today, we are able to apply a more gender balanced translation that wouldn't be incorrect. Likely was not the way it was intended, and more definitely wasn't the way it was read by the rabbis.
Thank you.
And I just, were women literate, and could they have picked up a text? Literacy, likely less literate than the men, but I'm not actually sure of literacy rates, and I think it would also depend on the time period and where exactly, and what languages they're literate in, right? Because this is all Hebrew, so maybe some women were literate in the vernacular, but not necessarily in Hebrew. So I don't have a solid answer for that, but I presume that literacy was lower among Jewish women than Jewish men. And so here's where we get to some of the fun stuff. Oh, we're so excited. Aaron, you had a question?
Yeah. So I know that there are examples in the Talmud of powerful women.
Yes.
A handful of them. So why are they there?
That's a really good question.
What are the rabbis trying to tell us?
I mean, I think does anyone have any insights? That's not really a focus of what we're talking about today, but I think it's a really interesting question. So I'm definitely down to kind of share and hear some perspectives. I see something in the chat. They were there because they were eggs. That's what I was going to say, Lynn. Do you want to? Pretty straightforward, but did you want to expand on that a little bit? Or?
No, I mean, I think that in these circles, some of these women were probably very prominent, and the rabbis all knew them, and they just, they're telling these stories, and a few women figured prominently, and I'm sure there were many more women who were wives of these rabbis who were knowledgeable about Torah, but they picked a few. We know a few of them by name, not many. And I think also some of them, I think, are to illustrate a certain point about holiness or something they're trying to teach. And sometimes it's a story to cast a little shade on one of the men. I think sometimes it is. Like there was a story about Ula, who was one of these famous rabbis, and the wife of one of the other famous rabbis wanted to participate in Kiddush at the dinner that she had just served them all. And he said, no, you can't participate in Kiddush because you're a woman. So she went downstairs and broke up all the wine vats. And it's like, I don't know whether it makes her look bad or makes him look bad, But it's probably something, I'm guessing it's so detailed, something like that probably really happened and they didn't want to leave it out.
I think that's some great insight. I think as to come back to some of the themes we've been exploring too, like obviously there is just a kind of litany of circumstances and questions that the rabbis have. Some of them are going to include women. I also think when we look at the biblical literature, one of the questions I had was, are these texts all meant to be prescriptive and telling us how things ought to be, or are they sometimes that level of description comes in as well? And so if you're writing about the world and problems and questions and issues, women play an important role in that. So it makes sense that there would be different representations. I mean, on the one hand, there's a lot more about men in this literature, but obviously women were there and part of these men's lives. So to kind of bring us to some fun stuff, I just wanted to, and I think some of us are already familiar, especially if you've been doing rabbinic work and study sessions and stuff. But there are tons and tons of references to the androgynous, the kind of androgyne. And so there are these different readings. We talked when we read Genesis about sort of the two different creation stories and the way in which, male and female, he created them seems to be one vision of creation with men and women created concurrently at the same time. And on the other hand, you get that second story of woman as a secondary creation out of Adam's rib. And so within the rabbinic tradition, there are all of these ways in which the rabbis are trying to grapple with the kind of uncertainty here and the lack of cohesion between these narratives. And so we have Rabbi Yirmiyah ben Elazar also said, Adam was first created with two faces, one face, one male and the other female. So you formed me behind and before and laid your hands upon me. So there's a citation to a psalm as the kind of proof text here for what the rabbi here is interpreting. And in Genesis Rabbah, which is an interpretation of the book of Genesis, once again, we have Rabbi Yirmiyah ben Elazar. When the Holy One created the first human, he created him as an androgynos. As it is said, male and female, he created them. And so here we have this kind of tradition that's emerging that clearly was part of the rabbi's consciousness and discourse. It gets preserved here. And there's some interesting parallels as well to Plato's Symposium and Aristophanes' description of the first humans as both male and female. And so there are different kind of bodily expressions of how this looks in terms of the two faces or a back here and a back there. But we have another reference in Bikurim to the kind of ambiguity of this initial kind of created being that still seems to be a part of society that the rabbis are at least aware of and noting. And so the androgynous is in some ways like men and in other ways like women. In other ways, he is like men and women, and in others, it's a little repetitive. But it's important to note that the term appears 32 times in the Mishnah and 283 times in the Talmud, again, with a focus on halacha. And so what's really interesting is there's this kind of question within sort of queer communities and gender queer communities of reclaiming these sort of non-binary gendered components here and these gender identities. The rabbis are not so focused on what it means, for that person to identify a certain way. They don't necessarily, that's not what their concern is. Their concern is just how does a person who has both male and female qualities enact and follow the rules, the halacha, the tradition. And so there are certain ways in which these androgynous figures accord with the behavior and the traditions and rituals of men, and others in terms of So I see there are two hands. It was Ellis. I think Ellis was first, and then Aaron.
I was wondering, it doesn't sound like this is something that was frowned upon or considered impure the way it's been handled in more modern times. Is that correct or no?
It seems so. What's interesting here is that it is kind of posed as a bit of a problem, but it's a problem on halachic grounds. It doesn't seem to be a problem on the basis of these people existing. That's not what's in question. And whether or not they can exist within this society, it's more just in a very sort of tightly binary worldview, how do you order things that fall outside of that order? So I don't know if that necessarily answers the question, but I think, you know, it's a difference in orientation of how we're coming to that question. There is a fundamental problem with androgynous identity for the rabbis, but it isn't the question of their existence or whether or not they should exist. It's how they're going to apply Torah. Aaron, you had a question as well?
Well, it was sort of the same question. I know that in the Talmud that the rabbis are perfectly capable of being derogatory to certain groups of people if they want to. And
Yeah.
yet I'm not sure that they, it's not clear that they do for the
Right.
androgynous. Is that correct? Or can, maybe you've read the whole thing and so you know. But
Not read the whole thing. Definitely some parts. And Lynn first, I think, and then was there another hand too, or a read?
Yeah, so my sense reading this is they were fine with androgynous people. The reason they didn't want them to lie with men is because they're absolutely go crazy if men sleep with men. They just can't, that's like a bad thing. They're just almost silent on women sleeping with women. And I guess they don't think women actually have sexual desires or drives, so they don't really care where women sleep together. I think it was mentioned once a while back, but kind of semi-derogatory terms. But as I understood, that's the reason, because in case an androgynous person is really a man, you don't want him lying with another man, fine, let him lie with a woman.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point. And what we're going to kind of come to a little bit as well is the question of reproduction. And I think within a more ancient worldview, without the scientific knowledge we have, it is males who take on the active role in reproducing. It's their seed. And so there might be a question there as well for androgynous beings. And we're going to see in the next slide the kind of distinctions in gendered identities that the rabbinic literature takes note of and represents. And so I think that might also be part of it. Ariv, did you want to?
Yes, the last bullet, sub-bullet on the page has a few things that I'm not clear about, but in particular, the red discharge. Are they talking about menstruation?
They're talking about menstruation there, and they're talking about white emissions being seminal fluids.
Well, I get that.
Yes.
So I was trying to figure out what red discharge they were talking about.
Yeah. So it's, it's not the way in which we necessarily are relating to these things, but it's the ways in which androgynes or androgynous need to be sort of defined and understood based on the aspects that are maybe more feminine and the aspects that are more masculine in terms of their sexual organs, in terms of their bodies. And then that has implications for their ritual state of purity and for their religious obligations.
Okay.
This gets very technical and we're not going into a ton of detail here. I just kind of wanted to direct us to these questions here. And we can definitely come back. Lynn, I think your hand was up first there as well.
Yeah, so today we think of gender as in part, having some biological basis, but very much having a social basis. How do people identify? And someone can biologically be a male or a female, but identifies as some other gender that might have characteristics of both or neither, or just whatever the person identifies as. So you could imagine a person who was biologically male living back in those times that chose to adopt overtly feminine characteristics. And I wonder if they would be considered androgynous, even though biologically they had male bodies.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think we can get some degree of insight here in the next slide. And I'm kind of being a little bit tongue in cheek when I say beyond the binary. Obviously, on the one hand, there is an acknowledgement of gender identities and states of being that are outside of just simply male and female. Obviously, as well, when we talk about a gender binary, that's a more modern construct. And so we're not necessarily asking these questions in the same way that the rabbis would have been asked. And I think that's important to note. But interestingly enough, the Talmud identifies 8 different sort of variations of gendered identities. And so Zachar is a male who presents as a male. Nekeva is a female. We talked already about the androgynos having both male and female characteristics. And the kind of reverse of that is the tumtum, who seems to be lacking sexual characteristics. And so here there is a kind of bodily form of whether, part of it is like whether they are growing pubic hair or whether, their voice changes. Like eunuchs are also grouped in with the androgynous or the tumtum in various forms. And sometimes the easier translation for us to understand here is a eunuch who's obviously had some removal. Aaron, yeah?
Yeah, I'm wondering in what contexts are they bringing this up? These 8 characters, what, is it halakha, or is it
Yeah,
inheritance,
it's
or is it
legal.
damages?
It's legal in terms of who's responsible for what kinds of rituals and who and in what ways, how you kind of identify, like we talked a little bit, we spoke of marriage, of capital punishment, of the ways in which, sometimes there are gendered punishments where, like for adultery in the Hebrew Bible, for example, the punishment is different for a man than it is for a woman. So what about a man who seems like a man, but maybe is also possessing some feminine characteristics? And so it becomes very almost tedious. So I didn't want to get too deep in the nitty gritty. I wanted to kind of keep it on a more big picture level. But certainly, it's not as though the rabbis are writing a treatise on these are all of the gender identities. It's these are things that come up in their very sometimes detailed processes of solving problems that maybe no one ever had, but that could have been had as thought experiments. Dan?
Yeah, well, reading this, I'm getting the impression that, kind of maybe contrary to what you just said, but I'm getting the impression that they were very well aware that there were people who didn't fit their norms of what male and female were, and that they were living within this society and they needed to make halakhic decisions about who was obligated. So that seems like it's the fact that they're bothering to figure out what these people need to do means, to me, says not only are they aware of the people, but they're including them in the community and trying to figure out what their obligations to the community are, and that they're having, like with the androgynous category, that there have some obligations that are male obligations and some that are female obligations. So they're not even like saying, okay, this is all the set of rules for over here. I just think it's much more.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. That's fine. I was just.
I think that's a beautiful way of expressing it. I think there's a lot of nuance here that the rabbis are taking. Sort of where I was going with that to Aaron is more so like, it's not that the rabbis are themselves constructing and composing a treatise on how people do identify, but in their treatment of particular cases of halakha and case law, they are accounting for the different experiences that they are observing within their community. And so there is that level of kind of thoughtfulness, which is really remarkable and really fascinating, especially as we come into a modern time where a lot of that thoughtfulness is less
they seem to be really having awareness of, like there's all kinds of genetic things where people have various forms of physical identity, when they're first born, and that things change, and it's just amazing.
Right. Yeah, and I think it was Lynn who kind of mentioned the distinction between gender and sex that we make in modern gender theory. But it's interesting here, the kind of spillover. There, on the one hand, there is an awareness that biological sex is not the be all end all. On the other hand, the varied levels of like gendered identity are also somewhat predicated in some of these examples on sort of physical sort of sexual attributes. And so so there's a distinction I thought was really interesting to kind of highlight here of the like the Chama versus the Adam. So whether someone was assigned a certain gender at birth and then they start to develop or stop to develop or like never fully develop certain things, that's a biological thing. And that is one form of a gendered identity. That is actually different than if someone, let's say a eunuch, snips, ouch, cuts off their balls, keep singing. But like that's a different gendered identity and different positionality. There are different halachic responsibilities involved there. So I think that it's really interesting. On the one hand, there is a deep sort of connection between the sexual attributes, which are, but there is also an awareness that sometimes those sexual attributes are not the extent of it, or it becomes more complicated, and that there are non-physical aspects of a gendered identity as well. And so there actually are there are prohibitions against cross-dressing, for example, in Talmudic literature. And that is because, again, it's kind of a blurring of a distinction. On the one hand, they seem okay with variations of gendered experience, but they need to be able to identify which aspects are okay to express in which way. So I think that's.
Do we have any like case studies, if you would, from the rabbis of people who were in the androgynous one, because that's what the first slide was about, where they actually say someone who was considered androgynous had children, and the children could not be, the androgynous person couldn't inherit and couldn't pass down inheritance, if I understood it correctly. Do we actually know of cases where that happened? Like where an androgynous person who was capable of impregnating a woman, married a woman, had children, did the children then be cut off from the line of inheritance?
That's a really interesting question. I don't have an easy answer for you. And part of that is that my knowledge of this corpus of literature is one part of, I don't know everything. The other part too, though, that I think is really important to keep in mind is that a lot of this is exercises in thought. These rabbis were very isolated, living, studying, and they're coming up with every which way thought experiment of what could possibly happen if all of these things collided. And so it's a little challenging to know. I think where we have sort of names and stories and sort of instances, maybe we can try and sort of historicize those. But also these are documents in the sense that they are historical, but they're not history in the way that we might want to think of in our modern sensibility. So Karen, you had a hand up as well.
Yeah, so are there stories of human intervention of making males female and females male later in their lives?
That's a really interesting question. I'm not aware of anything like there seems to be an awareness that, you know, there is human intervention for some of those things. I'm not sure if um, those are deliberate sort of choices in identity, or more so like, you know, something was injured, or you know. So I don't have a good answer for that. This is something that really fascinates me, and I'm still learning along with you guys about sort of the nuances and the complexities. But I think it's really an interesting place to kind of ask.
Since there's such controversy today
Yeah,
about doing this,
right.
it would be interesting to know if there are such stories in the Bible
Yeah,
for those who are objecting to this kind of treatment. And those people may be very pseudo oriented to biblical texts being literal. You know, I'd like to know whether this was just in the rabbis' minds as
yeah,
possibilities, but that there are not really any depictions in writing about this happening at that time.
yeah. Thank you, Karen. I'm just throwing a recommendation that's not really related to ancient Judaism or any of that sort of thing, but it really interesting and timely, just in terms of thinking about these questions as we're dealing with them, and looking at the history within North America of sort of gender nonconformity. And it's a book called Histories of the Transgender Child by Jules Gill Peterson. And it's looking at sort of gender studies and actual histories of children who were gender nonconforming over the last century, and this research that was being done at Johns Hopkins University. And so there was actually just, I was listening to an NPR podcast where the author was just interviewed, and they were also interviewed on a Canadian CBC podcast. Anyway, just popped into my mind, so I thought that might be worth sharing for anyone who's kind of thinking about these questions in the modern, in the contemporary landscape and the politicization of that. So I want to close this up and get to a little bit about Kabbalah. We're running a little short on time again, but I'm grateful for all of the questions and the enthusiasm and just kind of learning together. I thought this was a helpful way that the scholar that I already mentioned, von Robert, describes sort of the rabbi's perspective on gender. So rabbinic thought doesn't posit an essential masculinity or femininity. It also really doesn't ascribe to an ontological kind of distinction between men and women. So essentialism is like, you know, there's a man, there's a woman, these are different things. Rabbinic thought is not really saying that specifically, but the halachic discourse maintains a kind of functional gender duality, which is rooted in the need, as we kind of alluded to, for reproduction of the Jewish collective body. So I really liked this quote that von Robert had. In sum, even though the rabbinic semiotics of the body open the gate towards a remarkable self-consciousness about the potential ambiguity of its signs, the same system manages to maintain its fundamental gender binarism in Jewish law. So I thought that was a really good way of kind of summing up a lot of the complexities here. We have this awareness, acknowledgement, and kind of deep thoughtfulness and thinking about different lived gender identities and experiences and what that looks like sort of physically, socially for these people. But at the same time, the system itself is based on a gender binary. And so where there are exceptions to that rule, there is also kind of adherence, the exception proves the rule. And so, you know, allowances are made up to a certain point. There's kind of a desire to categorize, even while acknowledging that some of the stuff is a little more challenging to categorize. But I thought that the distinction between sort of the function of gender rather than its actual existence as a category was a helpful way for kind of coming to terms with the ways in which there is a deep binary and also there is an that awareness of beyond the binary. Lynn, you had raised your hand.
Yeah, so a number of years ago, I read in National Geographic, they had a feature about Albania. And in Albania, there are these women that are what's called sworn virgins. And they're women that never marry and they live as men and they have male roles in society. They might, I think they were in more rural villages and they would run their farms like men ran their farms. And they showed a photograph of one of these women and you could have fooled me. She looked like a man. I mean, in every way, you know, her pose, her sort of attitude and her dress and the way she wore her hair appeared to be male. And you know, I don't think that that is anything new. And I think the rabbis, you know, disapproved of stuff, you know, certain things, but I think that all the variations that we see in gender, you know, identity and presentation and behavior today, I suspect existed 2000 years ago. And, you know, some of it like just homosexual relationships, overt homosexual relationships between men were disapproved of. And if I'm sure people were doing that, but they kept it quiet. And I'm sure gay relationships, they wouldn't call them gay, they'd call them homosexual between women, I'm sure were happening and they probably kept it quiet too. And probably men lived as women and women lived as men because that was how they felt. And it was just kind of, yeah, this is our Aunt Sadie and she's a little strange, but she's okay, she does the cooking, but it was really Uncle Sadie. You know what I'm saying? And I'm sure all of those variations existed back then. Maybe the rabbis just didn't even know how to talk about them. I mean, because human nature hasn't changed that much. People are people and everybody's different.
100%. So it's always what I find interesting here too is just, you know, what are the questions, what are we bringing to this conversation? And the goals for the rabbis are to kind of assign order, to categorize. And so there's a particular framework or perspective that they bring to that, but they're not, you know, for anyone, as you're saying, who says that, you know, outside of that non-binary gender identity is a new thing, it's not.
Yeah, I mean, the
very-
norm was men and women marrying and having children, just like it is today. It was the default, but I think I agree with Nan that it's impressive that the rabbis recognized that there existed people who varied from that norm, and they wanted to include them as best they could.
Thank you. I see, Nan, did you have your hand up again? Oh, you're muted. Oh, Nan? You're still muted.
Sorry, I thought I was talking.
Happens to the best of us.
I was trying to remember, I was going to ask this earlier, but I couldn't remember where I heard it. So, but I still can't remember, so I'll just put it out there. I believe at some point I heard someone postulating that one of the reasons why there were halakhic differences between men and women was that women, as the people who are primarily responsible for raising children, wouldn't be able to, like the time bound the time bound laws, that a woman might not be able to do that because she had to attend to a child at that immediate moment and couldn't take, you know, the time away. And I just wondered if that's something that people think is actually true, or if they have a reason why the differences are between men and women, or if that's just a simplistic view of it.
Aaron says you've heard that too. I definitely, I wouldn't discount any of those. I don't have a way of saying yes, no, maybe so. My guess is probably that could have played a role in how these rules and regulations were conceived, and like it wouldn't make sense to have a woman required to do X if she's already doing Y. So that's definitely possible. I do want to move really quickly. We may have to kind of speed through this last section here on Kabbalah. But I just wanted to kind of call attention as well, because I think it brings us back to the Song of Songs in a really kind of beautiful circular way. So if any of you are familiar with the Zohar, it's a classic work of the Jewish mysticism tradition of Kabbalah. It's a 13th century Castilian Jewish text, and it was believed to be the recovered mystical voice of ancient rabbinic sages. That was, the authorial voice is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who's one of the great sages of the rabbinic period. More likely, I meant to say circulated, but I missed a C. So circulated by Rabbi Moshe de Leon in Castile. It seems more likely from a historical standpoint that Rabbi Moshe de Leon was the one who also composed this text, but interestingly enough, it's written in Aramaic to kind of give it this vein of antiquity, and to make it seem like it's really this ancient text that was just discovered, which is a common way of attributing a text, whether or not it's the most honest way, but it comes to hold a very significant position in specifically Jewish mystical circles. And within the Zohar, God is represented as a dynamic flow of cosmic energy, composed of 10 different dimensions or stages of emanation, which we call the Sefirot. It's helpful to note that this language of Sefirot, and it's not present in the text explicitly, but it's been deduced, and the text is trying to position itself as being more old and ancient than it was. So these are kind of categories that have been imposed through study on the text, but they're pretty clearly there in different words. And so the Sefirot, these different emanations or aspects, are in flux from a primordial source of infinity, which is identified as Ein Sof, as being without end in Hebrew. So the infinite one is the source of all. And it's from I really liked how this Kabbalistic scholar kind of explained it. It's a little bit hard, especially in 10 minutes, to go through the complexities of the Jewish mystical tradition and how they pertain to gender, but I did find Fishbane's quote here. So from the mystery of that infinity, of that Ein Sof, a spark flashed in the darkness, the colors of all that would be exploded in a wondrous array. From the most infinitesimal point of concentration, the containment of all future being in complete potentiality, the rivers of divine life were opened, the concealed spring of the universe overflowed with an energy too immense to contemplate. And so we're going to just take a quick look at what these emanations or Sefirot actually are. So they're the 10 they're also described as rivers of cosmic light, or the chambers of the inner divine self. It's a little confusing. It's one of those things, similar to something in Christianity with the Trinity. Like, even though there is this multiplicity, there is a oneness in these 10 forms. They all comprise the wholeness and the unity of Ein Sof and of God. So these 10 are really one, but there are these different aspects or attributes. So if we look here at the diagram, we have Keter, the divine crown. We have Chokhmah here as wisdom, Bina on the other side, understanding, Chesed, mercy, Din, justice or judgment. Tiferet is here in the middle. Netzah is eternity on the right. Chod, you can read, Yesod, and Shekhinah. So the divine self is understood within Kabbalah and within the Zohar as being dominated by this polarity between what we have on the right side, so Chochmah, Chesed, and Netzah, and the left side, which is Deen, or judgment, or justice. And so basically you have here Tiferet and Shekhinah outside of these two sides as kind of the masculine lover, and Shekhinah being the feminine presence of God. That is, it gets a little confusing. So all this to say, and I know I have 5 minutes, so I'm gonna speed through. We can come back to this if we need to. But the goal of sort of Kabbalistic thought is this restoration of a harmony between these two different forces in the cosmos. So between the right side's dominance and the left, we want a harmony. And interestingly enough, that harmony is a dominance of that right side of Chesed. And of course, as we find in many things that are sort of a little more binary, the right side of Chesed is characterized as the masculine aspects or attributes of God. Surprise, surprise. And so interestingly enough, there is this kind of polarity on the one hand of these masculine and feminine things. They require balance, and they are sort of, in order to get that harmony, there needs to be a subsumption or subsuming of the feminine within the masculine. So we're starting to actually, this is my last slide, so I'm sorry for the speed round. But what is really interesting here and kind of brings us back to our focus of all of the commonality in these topics we've been exploring, is that the perfected state of divinity here is actually an androgynous masculine, the ultimate maleness of God, thus understood to relocate femininity back into the masculine. So it's like a return of the primordial paradigm in the way biblical Eve is drawn from the original body of Adam. So I know this is a lot of words, a lot of complexity, but essentially, I just wanted to kind of highlight again this coming back to the original created state of being. There's a mirroring or reflection of this within the divine realms and the human realms. And so we have a mirroring of that initial creation of the cosmos with the creation of human life and reproduction. And I've bolded the word theurgy. That's just a fancy word for sort of human rituals meant to mirror divine rites and practices. And so what we have here is sexual intimacy as the kind of way in which humans model and help bring about that divine harmony between the masculine and the feminine. How do we do it? It's through the coming together of the masculine and the feminine in sexual intercourse between men and women. And so Yehudim is this process of unification, which is seen as the restorative task of humanity. And so to kind of bring it back to Song of Songs, I think it's really interesting and important to kind of understand this reading of Song of Songs as allegory, as this coming together of, you know, God and the human relationship as masculine and feminine. We see this similarly expressed in the traditions of Kabbalah in this mystical tradition. And so there are these commonalities of sort of balance that go all the way back and are really drawing on the language of Genesis and the creation of men and women cleaving to each other like they are, you know, of one, coming together. And we see this reflected in how reproduction takes place of the cosmos, of the world, and also reproduction on a human level of the Jewish people. And so there is this link within Kabbalistic tradition, like it's actually, there's a whole thing of how marital sex on the Sabbath is what brings about this yichud, this unification of these divine elements of the Tiferet, the masculine and the feminine aspects of God. So I know that was a lot in about 8 minutes, but hopefully
That's an amazing slide.
Thank you. It's a pretty amazing tradition. So I hopefully this just sort of is either a first taste or a refresher on stuff. Definitely, I think there's so much more to explore, but I really just wanted to kind of point us all in this direction. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, thanks everyone for your participation, and hope you have a great week.
Very interesting, Simon. I like the way you wrap things up here in the last slide. Brings it all together.
Thank you. Had to rush our way through it a little bit, but it does come
It's
together.
okay.
All right, thank you. Were there any questions?
Can I make a brief comment, which is on the side just before this?
Yeah.
That things that are supposedly masculine in contemporary life, I would have said the attributes that they're calling masculine, we tend to call feminine, and vice versa. And just
Thank you, Nan. I agree.
That's a really funny observation. I mean, everything here, it's like how pink was a masculine color until it was a feminine color.
Right, exactly.
So yeah, thank you for that. Bonnie, did you also have something to add? Oh, you're muted.
On the last slide, Yehud, I think that's interesting because isn't that the word used for the bride and groom after the ceremony to have some time by themselves? And so this Kabbalistic word has become a natural word in Judaism that we've taken to be unification without the subtext of who's more dominant.
Yeah, I think there are definitely ways in which even like the whole practice of the ketubah, many Jewish couples now are modifying the language or adding some extra caveats, but there is something very powerful about just sort of the linking of tradition and the ways in which we don't always even know some of the sources for where these traditions come from, but they are still very much present. So yeah, that's an amazing, a really wonderful point as well. So thank you. All right. I think without
Thanks a lot, Simon.
Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.